She set the ledger down so carefully that it didn't make a sound. That was the thing no one would remember afterward. Not the silence, not the hour, not even the fact that she had been awake since 4 in the morning, finishing the quarterly accounts that her husband would present to his business partners as his own work. What they would remember, if they remembered anything at all, was that Josephine Aldridge smiled at the dinner table on the evening of March the 14th, and that by the time the sun rose over the Connecticut hillside the following morning, she was gone. But that comes later. Everything comes later, when you've spent long enough learning to wait. Josephine had been 23 years old when she married Theodore Aldridge. She had not been in love with him. This was not, in the world she had grown up in, considered a significant obstacle. Her father had called it a practical arrangement. Her mother had called it a blessing. Her aunt, who was the only honest woman in the family, had called it what it was, a transaction. The Vance family had standing and daughters. The Aldridges had money and ambition. The math was simple. Theodore was not a cruel man. Josephine would be precise about this for the rest of her life, because precision mattered when you were trying to understand how you could lose 9 years to something that never felt like a catastrophe until it all came apart at once. He did not raise his voice. He did not humiliate her publicly, or gamble, or drink beyond what was socially acceptable in the circles they kept. He was, by every measurable standard, a decent man. He simply did not see her. Not in the way that she had hoped someone might, someday. Not in any way that suggested she occupied space in his mind beyond her function. She managed their household, a substantial one, 3 floors, 6 staff. The kind of place that required constant diplomatic management just to keep the laundry from becoming a political incident. She handled his correspondence when he was traveling, which was often. She planned his dinners, his charitable appearances, the careful seasonal rotation of guests that kept Theodore Aldridge visible in the right rooms with the right people. She also quietly kept the books. Theodore was gifted at vision and terrible at numbers. He had learned this about himself early and compensated by surrounding himself with capable people. What he had not anticipated when he married Josephine Vance was that she was one of the most capable people he would ever encounter in his life. She had a mind for finance that would have made her father's business partners deeply uncomfortable had any of them known it belonged to a woman. Instead, it belonged to Theodore's wife, which meant it belonged, in the way that everything belonging to a wife belonged, to Theodore. She didn't resent this at first. She had understood the arrangement. What she had not understood, what no one had thought to tell her, because no one in her world talked about such things plainly, was what it would feel like to do essential work and be invisible while doing it. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes from being necessary and unknown. It is quieter than other kinds. It doesn't announce itself. You wake up one morning and you are 31 years old, and you are pouring coffee for a man who has not asked about your day in 4 years. And you realize the loneliness has been there so long that you had started to think it was just the shape of things. Josephine had started to think it was just the shape of things. The dinner party on March the 14th was Theodore's idea, as all social functions were Theodore's idea in the sense that he mentioned them, and Josephine executed them. 14 guests, a 6-course meal, 3 different wines that Josephine had selected, and Theodore had approved without tasting them first. The Hargrove brothers from Boston were coming. So was Mr. Aldridge's attorney, a humorless man named Fletcher, who had a habit of directing his questions to Theodore, even when the answers were things only Josephine would know. She had spent 3 days preparing, not because the dinner required 3 days. She could have managed it in 2. But because the Hargrove account was important to Theodore, and she wanted the evening to be right. She wanted him, not for the first time, not for the last time, to look at what she had built and feel something. Gratitude perhaps, recognition. Even just awareness. She had ironed his correspondence. She had confirmed the menu twice. She had written out the seating arrangement in 3 different configurations, before deciding on a final arrangement that would ensure the younger Hargrove brother, who had a competitive streak, was seated where he could not easily speak directly to the elder one. This was the kind of thinking Josephine did constantly, automatically, without being asked, without being thanked. It was the kind of thinking that Theodore would never know had happened, because when things went smoothly, there was nothing to point to. Smoothness was invisible. Only failures left marks. The dinner went beautifully. The soup was warm. The wine breathed exactly as long as it needed to. Fletcher made a remark about the quarterly numbers that Josephine had prepared, and Theodore received the compliment the way a man receives, a compliment about something he considers his natural territory. It was near the end of the second course that it happened. Theodore was mid-sentence, something about the Springfield investment, and he turned toward Josephine to include her in the conversation, or rather, to indicate her existence to the table. And he said, with the ease of a man saying something he had said 100 times, "Catherine always has an eye for these things." The table didn't stop. That was the strange part. 2 or 3 guests continued their own conversations. The candles kept burning. The younger Hargrove brother reached for his wine, but 2 people at that table heard it clearly. One of them was Fletcher, who looked down at his plate. The other was Josephine, Catherine. Her name was not Catherine. Her name had never been Catherine. She did not know, in that moment, who Catherine was. A previous acquaintance, perhaps. Some woman from Theodore's past who had once made an impression. And she found that she did not particularly need to know. What she needed to know, she already knew. She had been married to this man for 9 years. She had managed his home and his accounts, and his social calendar, and his quarterly presentations, and the careful, invisible architecture of his entire professional life. And he had called her by another woman's name with the ease of someone who had never thought about her name very hard at all. Josephine picked up her fork. She set it back down. She smiled. A small smile. The kind that looks like serenity from across a table and is, in fact, something else entirely. A decision, made quietly, in the middle of a dinner party, while the candles burned and the second course sat half-finished on 14 plates. Theodore noticed the smile. He did not notice what it meant. She did not leave that night. She was more methodical than that. This was something people would misunderstand later, when the facts of Josephine Aldridge's departure from the house on Wethersfield Avenue became a subject of conversation in the circles that such subjects traveled through. They would say she acted impulsively. They would say it was the kind of thing a woman does when she is being dramatic. They would not consider that the impulse had been building for 9 years, and that the smile at the dinner table was not the beginning of anything, but the end of a very long decision she had been making, without quite knowing she was making it. She cleared the table that night, as she always did, supervising the kitchen, seeing the guests to their coats, exchanging the appropriate pleasantries. She stood beside Theodore in the doorway and accepted the Hargrove brothers' thanks, with a warmth that was genuine, because she had liked the dinner even if she had not liked what happened during it. Theodore said, when the door closed, that it had gone well. She agreed. He said Fletcher seemed pleased. She said she thought so too. He went upstairs. Josephine went to the study. She sat down at the desk, her desk, functionally, though it had Theodore's name on the correspondence printed above it. And she opened the household ledger. She had been keeping parallel records for 14 months, not for any purpose she had consciously named. She had told herself it was organization, a backup, good financial practice. She understood, sitting there in the quiet of the house after midnight, that she had known, some part of her, for a long time. She spent 3 hours organizing what she needed. The personal account her aunt had helped her establish 2 years ago, the one Theodore knew about in the abstract, and had never thought to examine. The letter she had written and rewritten in her head, on and off, over the course of several months without admitting to herself that it was real. The address of her college friend, Nora, in Hartford, who had a spare room and had written once, 2 years ago, in a letter that seemed casual and was not, "You know you are always welcome here, Joe. I mean that without any conditions attached." Josephine had kept that letter. She had kept it in the back of the ledger, folded into the inside cover, which was perhaps the most honest thing she had done in 9 years. She wrote to Theodore. She wrote carefully, the way she did everything. She told him that she did not hold him responsible for the shape of their marriage, because she understood that they had both been given a script and had followed it faithfully, and the script was the problem, not the performance. She told him that she had managed his household accounts well, and that she was leaving documentation for everything, the vendors, the contracts, the seasonal schedules, so that whoever took over would have everything they needed. She told him she had been good at her work, and that she hoped he knew that, even if he had never said it. She did not tell him where she was going. She signed her name, Josephine. Not Mrs. Aldridge, not his wife. Just Josephine, the way she had signed things before she had been anyone's anything, when she was 22 years old, and her name was still entirely her own. She left before sunrise. The walk to the station was 40 minutes in the cold, with a bag that was heavier than she had planned and lighter than she had feared. The city was very quiet. There was a period, just before 5 in the morning, where she could hear her own footsteps on the pavement and nothing else. and she realized she could not remember the last time she had heard silence, without also feeling the weight of everything she was responsible for inside it. The silence, this time, was just silence. She had enough money. She would not be comfortable, not immediately, but she was not helpless. She had spent 9 years learning to manage assets under constraint, and she was very good at it. She could find work. She had already, quietly, begun an introduction through her aunt to a small accounting firm in Hartford that was, apparently, willing to consider someone with her qualifications, regardless of the fact that those qualifications had been demonstrated in a domestic setting rather than a professional one. The interview was the following Thursday. She thought about this as the train station came into view. She thought about the interview. She thought about Nora's spare room and whether the bed was soft, and what it would feel like to sleep somewhere that no one needed anything from her in the morning. She bought her ticket. She sat down on the bench inside and waited for the 5:15 to Hartford. She was not, she noticed, crying. She had expected to be crying. She felt instead a strange steadiness, the kind you feel after a very long time of bracing yourself against something, and then suddenly not bracing anymore. Like standing up straight for the first time in years, without knowing your back had been bent. Theodore read the letter standing in the hallway. He had found it at the desk when he came down for breakfast, which was late. Later than usual, because Patterson, the household cook, had not started the stove at the regular time, because no one had told Patterson what time to start the stove, because Josephine was the one who told Patterson these things, and Josephine was not there. Theodore read the letter once, and then he sat down in the chair beside the writing desk, which was not a chair he normally sat in, and he read it again. He was not, in the first reading, sure what he was feeling. Something had clarified in the night, and he had not been there to see it. He went back through the dinner in his mind with the methodical focus he usually reserved for financial problems, because this was the kind of problem his mind reached for methodical focus to handle, and he arrived at the moment, the name, and he stopped. He had not meant to say Catherine. He knew as he sat there that he could not fully explain why he had. Catherine had been a woman he had known briefly, years before his marriage, someone who had managed her family's affairs with a kind of quiet competence that he had admired. He had not thought of her in years. He did not know how the name had come to his mouth. He knew that it had, and that Josephine had heard it, and that she had smiled in a way that he had registered as pleasant, and that he now understood was something else. He sat with this for a long time. He thought about what Josephine had written, that she did not blame him, that the script was the problem. He understood that she was being generous, and he understood, in a way that was uncomfortable and therefore probably true, that her generosity itself was a kind of evidence. A woman who had been seen would not need to be generous about not being seen. She would simply have been seen. The generosity was the shape that absence takes when it has gone on long enough to become ordinary. Theodore Aldridge was not a man who had much practice, sitting with the particular kind of discomfort that comes from recognizing that you have been careless with something precious. He had been careful his whole life with money and reputation and professional relationships. He had not thought of his wife as something that required the same care, because his wife had always simply been there, managing, smoothing, preparing the ground so that Theodore could walk across it without noticing the ground at all. He picked up the letter and read it a third time. He noticed, for the first time, how she had signed it. Fletcher heard about it through the usual channels that such things traveled through. He said nothing for several days, which was characteristic of him, and also, in this case, appropriate. He had seen her face at the dinner table, and he had understood what he was seeing, and he had thought, with a respect he had never quite had occasion to express, that whatever Josephine Aldridge decided to do next would probably be well considered. He was right. She had the interview on Thursday. She arrived 10 minutes early, and was kept waiting for 20, which she recognized as a test and treated accordingly. She used the time to review the papers she had brought, and when she was finally shown in, she was the calmest person in the room. The firm was run by a man named Archibald Cook, who had a brusque manner and a sharp eye, and who asked her 3 questions about ledger reconciliation that she answered with a precision that made him stop and look at her directly for the first time. "Where did you study?" he asked. "I didn't," she said. "Not formally. I managed my husband's household accounts for 9 years. Archibald Cook was quiet for a moment. "The Aldridge accounts?" She paused. "Yes." Another silence. "I've seen those numbers," he said. "They're clean." "Yes," she said. "They are." He offered her a position before she left the building. Theodore wrote to her 3 weeks after she left. He had spent those 3 weeks managing the household, or rather failing to manage it in a way that made visible everything that had previously been invisible. He had not realized how many vendors had accounts with Josephine. He had not realized how many of his professional relationships involved a courtesy that she had been quietly maintaining on his behalf. Birthday notes, acknowledgments of business milestones, the careful social reciprocity that kept a man well regarded in rooms he didn't always think to tend. He had not realized how much of his smoothly running life was in fact her hands. He had hired a household manager within 10 days, a competent woman named Mrs. Drummond who was efficient and impersonal, and who had looked at Josephine's documentation and said, with evident respect, that whoever had prepared these records was very thorough. Theodore to Joseph. Yes, he had not elaborated. The letter he wrote to Josephine was not the first letter he drafted. The first letter was about the household. He read it over and understood it was wrong and set it aside. The second was an explanation of what had happened at the dinner. The name, the error, his understanding of it. He read it over and understood it was insufficient and set it aside. The third letter he wrote very late at night, alone in the house after Mrs. Drummond had gone home and Patterson had cleared away the dinner things, and it was the only one he sent. He told her that he had read her letter many times. He told her he understood that she was not asking him for anything. He told her that the accounts she had kept were extraordinary, that the documentation she had left was the most complete financial record he had encountered in any professional context. That he had said this to Fletcher, and Fletcher had agreed. He told her that he did not know how to undo 9 years of not noticing, and that he was not sure it was possible to undo, but that he was asking, not for her to come back. He understood that she would not on those terms, but asking whether she would be willing to correspond, to be known, in the way that correspondence makes two people known to each other. Slowly, if she chose. At her own pace, in her own terms. He told her. He knew her name. He did not explain what he meant by this. He thought she would understand. She read the letter on a Sunday morning in Nora's spare room, which had a window that looked out over a small, unremarkable garden, and which she had come to love with an intensity that's a prior. The bed was soft. No one needed anything from her in the mornings. She had been at the accounting firm for 2 weeks. Archibald Cook was exacting and occasionally abrupt and had not complimented her work directly once, which she found, to her own amusement, refreshing. The work was not glamorous. It was also, in a way she had not been prepared for, entirely hers. When she caught an error in the Morrison ledger at 3:30 on a Thursday afternoon, and the numbers came clean, and she sat back in her chair and thought, I did that. There was no husband to present the result, and no dinner party to prepare, and no careful social architecture to maintain. There was just the work, and her name on it. She held Theodore's letter for a long time. She thought about what he had written. She thought about the 9 years. She thought about the name, Catherine, and how it had not been cruelty, which was almost more complicated than cruelty would have been. Cruelty you could be angry at. This was something else. Neglect without malice, absence without intention, a slow erosion of a person's outline, until she was more function than name. She had let it happen, in part. She had maintained a household of careful silence because the alternative, saying plainly what she needed, had seemed impossible in the world they occupied together. She had not known how to ask. He had not known there was anything to ask for, and 9 years had passed. She understood this. She had tried, in her letter, to say it plainly. She also understood that understanding it was not the same as going back. She set Theodore's letter on the windowsill beside a small potted plant that Nora had given her the week before, because Nora was the kind of person who gave you plants without making it a significant gesture. She looked at the garden. She thought about the Morrison ledger. She thought about Thursday morning, when she had arrived at the firm before anyone else and unlocked the door herself, and stood for a moment in the empty office, thinking about how quiet a room could be when it was her own kind of quiet. She thought about whether she would write back. She would, she decided, not because she was forgiving the 9 years. She did not know yet, and might never know, how to hold 9 years of not being seen, but because the man who had written that letter was trying to see her, in the only way he currently knew how, and she was not someone who refused a genuine attempt just because it came late. She had been precise about things her whole life. She could be precise about this too, but she would not go back to the house on Wethersfield Avenue. She had said this to Nora, once, in the way you say things you want to make real by saying them out loud. You don't have to. Nora had said, which was the right answer. Her life had a different shape now. She was still learning the edges of it, the corners she hadn't explored yet, the rooms she hadn't opened. It was smaller than the house on Weathersfield Avenue in most of the ways that could be measured. It was larger in all of the ways that mattered. She got up and found a pen. She wrote his name at the top of the page, Theodore, and then she sat for a moment looking at it. The name of the man she had married at 23, the man who had not seen her, the man who was perhaps just beginning to look. She wrote, I am willing to correspond. I am not willing to be invisible. If you understand the difference, write again. She signed it. Josephine, just Josephine. Her name, the whole of it, no one's but hers. She folded the letter and set it on the table to be posted in the morning. Outside, the Connecticut morning was coming in pale, and even through the window, and Josephine Aldridge, or Josephine Vance, she had not yet decided, sat in the good chair by the window, in the room that was hers, with the quiet that was hers, and opened the Morrison ledger, and went back to work.